Shout out to all of them. Jump right into the announcements. Just heard about this last night, but Chattanooga is getting another developer conference, so that's exciting. I don't know if you guys knew, but DevLink shut down, so that was kind of like Chattanooga's developer conference du jour, and we're getting another one. And so I'm going to read my notes here because I haven't memorized this. It's called Scenic City Summit. It's being put on by Tech Council here in town. And Greg Ostermeyer and, let's see, who else? Brandon and Stuart. You probably know those. They're all CHA devs, and they're spearheading the organization of that conference. And it's going to happen on August 12th. $65 a person. It's a one-day conference. It's going to happen at UTC. Lunch will be provided, along with a free subscription of Code Magazine. So, and there's going to be a lot of really good speakers. So I've heard some of who's going to be there. I'm excited about it, and I'll be there, and you guys should be too. Let's see. Does anybody have community announcements? I feel like I had some people tell me that maybe they did. Anybody want to make an announcement? Community? Speak now or forever hold your peace. No? Okay. Well, I think that's pretty much it. We should let our speaker today, Mike, everybody give it up for Mike. Mike, we'll leave it to you.
All right, is this thing on? And there we go, perfect. All right, well, thanks for coming today. Hopefully I'll have a little time at the end for question and answers. This is going to be a very loose talk. So I've given, whoops. No, is it not? All right, well, I'll just do my clicker here. So I've given a number of talks about the experience I had at Google, culture change, automated testing, trying to bring that in the government, these big dramatic talks, and I'm kind of tired of giving those, to be honest. But if you want to see videos of the talk I gave at TVA this past Monday that I delivered last week at DevOps Days DC, you're welcome to check out the video. The video, it starts off at 47:20. And I've got some other presentations and videos on my blog. But in this talk, I really wanted to try and zoom in on something I just touched on in the other talks, and that's the role of documentation and training in the whole culture change mission, because I think that's, an underappreciated aspect of trying to get things to get ideas to actually stick in an organization. So I am going to, oops, forgot, that doesn't work. I am going to start by going back to the state of testing at Google 2005. I actually pulled this image of the 2005 web server. Maybe you remember, maybe you don't, but back then, automated testing wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now, and it certainly wasn't as common within Google. And what made it worse, at the time, a unit test defined within Google was anything that ran in under 5 minutes. So if your test ran in under 5 minutes, you just called it a unit test. Otherwise, it was a regression test that could go off, to try to solve the halting problem. I mean, it could take arbitrarily long. And we were growing, of course, new developers that are writing all this new code to prove themselves. And the tools we were using at the time, the build tools actually, were just getting crushed under the load. So people really had a hard time with testing. Okay, there were two number ones, I'm sorry. So the tie for number one reason for not testing, people would say, oh, my code is too hard to test. And we got this exact answer from an internal survey that Google does every year. And what we eventually figured out is people were saying, I don't know how. Like I said, it wasn't ubiquitous yet. People didn't have experience. They didn't know what it meant to write testable code. I was telling somebody yesterday that at the time, people thought, well, I don't want a bunch of classes and files. That's a bunch of complexity. I need to put everything in one class. Oh, boy. A lot of these folks never worked on a project that was super well tested, and even though they were super smart, maybe they came from a successful company already, or they came straight out of MIT or Stanford, they hadn't really been in an environment. They maybe had been in an environment on successful projects, but not with thousands of developers and millions of lines of code getting written. And most of them had never, like I said, they're successful. They've never been on a death march project. I had by the time I got to Google. So really the subtext beneath all of these reasons is that, for all the knowledge and power that these people had, testing was not within their grasp at the time. It was just beyond their experience. The other number one reason was, I don't have time to test. And again, part of it was the tools were just slowing down with all the new code that was getting written, all the changes and the churn. Unit tests took 5 minutes. I mean, I think that speaks volumes right there. And then everybody's under pressure to deliver, right? You're evaluated on what you deliver, how much revenue is generated, or how many resources you save or utilize. And a lot of these projects didn't have a whole lot of tests to begin with, if they had any. So again, the subtext was, because everything is so slow, examples are hard to come by, good examples, people really couldn't afford the time to learn how to do proper automated testing. So that amounted to a culture that for a long time was hostile to automated testing. But you'll see who we is in a minute. We knew that the culture had to change. But these excuses were valid. Just trying to argue people down from these excuses wasn't going to accomplish anything. It's just going to irritate people and make them less motivated to adopt automated testing. So, it took some courage for people to kind of stand up against the tide of developers who thought you were wasting their time, or managers who thought you were distracting their people from delivering features. But the nice thing is, just because one part of the culture is broken doesn't mean that you can't go along with the rest of it. So we eventually found a way to take the parts of the culture that worked in our favor to change the parts of the culture that we wanted to fix. And ultimately, the culture changes when the right thing to do becomes the easy thing to do. Whoops. Hence the title of this talk. And the key moment when that happens is when people finally know what the right thing to do is. So they have to know, first of all. And then they feel like they have the power to do it. And this is a little paraphrase from one of my favorite books by another troublemaker. But he makes a good point. Like, people won't even think about how am I going to test this code if they just feel like they don't know where to start, or they don't have the time to learn. So I think most of us, I guess, Shaw devs, we're developers, or at least in the proximity of developers for a good part of our time. We know that making something easy to accomplish actually takes a lot of hard work, a lot of thought, a lot of preparation. And convincing other developers to do something they don't see value in, that's a monumental task. So there were two prongs to our mission. Of course, tools were an issue. We solved that problem in parallel with what I'm about to show you. But just giving people faster tools wasn't enough. It's like, so you've got a power tool. What do you do with it? So there are two paths you can go by. You can try to find ways to spread knowledge that don't overwhelm people or seem like a whole bunch of stuff that they have to learn all at once. Or you can instigate a crisis where people are in so much pain they're ready to try anything, right? So we actually did film a video. Again, we'll see in a minute. We made a fun little video that talked about the end of Google and how testing saved the day. It's quite funny. But fortunately, we didn't have to do that for real. So before I get into the knowledge spreading things that we did, throw a model up here to keep in mind when I'm talking about this. If you have you ever read Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. He takes this diffusion of innovations curve comprised of innovators, early adopters, I lump them together, call them instigators. The early majority, they're the folks that, they actually do want to change, but they're not the experts like these folks. They need something they can take, they can use, they can understand. The late majority will just go along with whatever the early majority is doing, and then the laggards are, you'll pry their old dead tools out of their cold dead hands, right? So forget about them. But the point is, trying to get the right messaging to the right people in the right order is key to trying to tip the culture towards the change that you're trying to instigate. So this little bridge, we'll see what that is in a little while. But first, I'd like to introduce to you the testing grouplet. We were the instigators within Google at the time. Bart Medarata, Nick Lasecki, they were the first leaders, and then I became one of the leaders after them. And so a grouplet's just a volunteer working group. We have 20% time. We think testing is important. We're going to work on this problem together for the good of the company. So we had practically no budget. We had absolutely no authority within the company, but we did have a lot of freedom to try crazy things to try and solve the problems that faced automated testing adoption. One of the things we did, maybe not so crazy, but we worked closely with our internal training organization, which is called ING-EDU. And so we produced a 1-hour lecture and then an accompanying exercise called a code lab to follow the lecture, where every new employee, new developer that came into the company, as part of their onboarding experience, they would attend the lecture, a testing grouplet member would provide the lecture, and then that would be followed by them trying to do some testing exercises in a lab, also proctored by another grouplet member. And Noogler, if you can figure that out, New Googler, it's our cute name for it. One of the core concepts, I mentioned before how a unit test was anything under 5 minutes. We realized we had to get rid of that baggage, at least internally, and start a new conversation. So we introduced small, medium, and large. But as you can see from the illustration, small really meant unit tests. Integration was medium, and large tests were system tests. And we used this illustration to demonstrate, rather than thinking automated tests are just one size fits all, you do have these different breeds. You've got a battery of tests that you want to be small and want to have small and fast, people can run all the time, and then all the way up to fewer large tests to give you confidence in the whole system. Sorry, I just for a second went into lecture mode, so I apologize. I just had a flashback to actually giving this lecture before. But also, NGDU was really great at helping us recruit people to deliver tech talks, both internally and outside the company. But the most impressive thing we did was this publication called Testing on the Toilet. We started 10 years ago, and it's still running. So we just had this crazy idea. How do we get people to pay attention to all this knowledge we're trying to share? And somebody just said, oh, well, hell, let's just put a flyer in the bathroom. They got time then, right? And then somebody ran with it, and 10 years later, we still have this. And it was really great because it was kind of the trickle effect. People kind of gradually, there was 1 episode a week. Actually, in the beginning, we didn't have enough material, and people started complaining that they wanted new episodes. Like, I've been reading about this for 2 weeks, we need more. So it basically got everybody's attention in a non-threatening, non-burdensome fashion. And it really kind of helped permeate some standard terminology and practices and tools throughout the company. I picked this image of this episode, not just because I wrote this particular episode. It just so happens encapsulates 2 other important projects that we initiated. One was Test Certified. This was kind of the roadmap that we established to kind of, first of all, hack the culture. As I was mentioning, one part of the culture that worked in our favor is that, Googlers love to measure stuff. They like to know where they stand, and they like to get rewarded for it with something free. So we set up this program with 3 levels There were various tasks per level, and of course they were in, order of increasing difficulty and commitment. And they just ate it up. But also at the same time, it removed that scary obstacle of, well, I don't know how to start testing. Well, here you go, start here. And we also had volunteers from all across the company, not just Grouplet members, that decided they would volunteer as test certified mentors. So they would basically take one or more teams under their wing and kind of advise them, this is what test certified's about, this is how you do this, and then validate their progress as they moved along. For the teams that needed some more hands-on TLC, we created an internal consultancy team that we called the Test Mercenaries, and I eventually was a member of this group as well. And so what we would do is we would go into a team's project, we would sit with them, work with their code, and over the course of a few months try to apply some of the, the tools and the techniques that we were talking about that we were publishing and testing on the toilet. And we also used Test Certified both as a guide and a goal for that engagement. And the other really great thing about being a part of the Mercenaries is we were looped in very tightly with the internal tools teams. So there would be, a new tool or a new feature of a tool. We'd apply it to some big hairy project, get some feedback, tell the tools team. They'd, make iterative improvements and so forth and so on. Then, speaking of, big, bold actions, we had these occasional events called Fixits. And I loved these things. I ran like 4 of them. But the idea was these weren't executive mandated affairs. This was just a testing grouplet saying, you know what? We want to organize a Fixit and get as many people as we can to work on testing, whether it's fixing a broken test, writing a new test, climbing the test certified ladder. And then eventually, when the tools started to become more and more powerful, this Fixits were a great way to get huge portions of the company at once to switch over. And we would have this body of knowledge that would develop at a fevered pitch right before the Fixit day. And then everything would happen. There'd be all this energy, and there would be free stuff. And so every time we had one of these events, it was like a quantum leap to the next plateau in terms of our culture change mission. And as I said, Googlers love getting free stuff, so they were always popular. Now, just quickly, I want to mention this was not, a grand plan from the beginning that was executed flawlessly within, a matter of months. This was a sloppy, nasty process that took 5 years. There were some dark days, but we had a lot of fun, and we eventually got there. And just quickly, I'm going to throw the model of that bridge across the chasm at you. So I call it the Rainbow of Death. It's not my original model. My friend Albert Wong, another ex-Googler, he came up with this model to describe some of the work he was doing as part of the US Digital Service. But I thought it just perfectly fit within that chasm because you're talking about a whole bunch of different functions that you as instigators have to fulfill in order to take an initiative from one side of the chasm to the other. And it's also got this nice little linear property where over here you can see that the instigators have to be hands-on. They have to do some actual things that nobody else can do. But as you kind of progress to the end, you've gotten to the point where the early majority can take something and do something with it by themselves. I'm just going to fill in very quickly. My other talks I talk about some of these things a little bit more. But very quickly, I'll just show you all the different things that we had going on and how they fit together. And of course, each one of these things may fill more than one box, but then that just gets kind of crazy. But right in the middle here, you can see where our documentation efforts were kind of critical to the whole thing. We had many different avenues to get information out. We had Test Certified to also frame a lot of that information. We had our Fixits to generate excitement, our Grouplet and mentors to build community. And then this empowerment stage, these two Fixits over here, this is when we had finally the marriage of knowledge and tools in place. The Revolution Fixit, January 2008, we rolled out this suite of tools that just overnight made builds like 5 times faster. And then 2 years later, March 2010, we had the test automation platform Fixit. And that was our continuous integration server, internal server. And I don't know if you know this about Google. I'm not sure if it's still true, but at least at the time, almost everything was developed in a single source tree. So this was the continuous integration server for that single source repository. And it got to the point where, as a build cop, if you're looking at the build for your project and you notice, oh, it just broke, oftentimes you would go into TAP, you would see, oh, exactly this change broke me. Let me look at the code review thread. Oh, a dozen people already reported the breakage. Look at that, it's been rolled back. And then by the time you look up, your build is fixed again. It was pretty cool. But like I said, it took 5 years to get there. A lot of hard work. And we tried many, many different things. There's more things we tried that didn't live long enough to make it into this model. But as you can see, just doing something, even though it seems like you're going in 50 different directions, it all kind of reinforces one another. Once you find things that stick, the right kind of documentation, the right format, the right mentoring and knowledge sharing model. So that was Google days. Eventually, I joined the federal government, and I want to give you a picture of what it was like. First, by comparing the first day that I joined Google. I'm not going to describe each one of these systems and everything, but there was just information everywhere, and there was already a very deep culture of give everybody access to as much information as possible, provide tools to make it easy, that sort of thing. My first day in the government was significantly different. It took a lot of effort to find information, to figure out, all right, I think the doc is over here that has the name of the person that I have to go ask to find the other doc that tells me what I have to do before I talk to the other person to get access to this system kind of thing, right? And that wasn't just exhausting for me, but all these people that had to answer my questions, and maybe it was the 50th time that they had to answer it, and they would answer it 500 more times, who knows? But that's when the light bulb went off in my head, and I'm like, everything we did at Google, we were just building on a platform of values and technology that was already there by the time I got there in 2005. So we kind of took it for granted at Google. And if you do a search for organizational training, organizational memory, knowledge sharing, there's all kinds of scholarly research on the subject that says why this is important, why you need to enable your employees to share information and learn from one another. So we kind of needed this on my team. So at the same time, we didn't have the budget of a Google or all of the liberties that we enjoyed in a private company. So what I started to do is I started, without realizing it, to say, hey, we need to build a learning organization. That wasn't in my vocabulary at the time. I just learned about it at the DevOps Enterprise Conference in October. But there's a book that I've discovered since then that I'm still working my way through, but it's called The Fifth Discipline by a fellow named Peter Singhi. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, if other people know how to say it. But even the introduction of that book spoke very clearly to my experience at Google. He had a quote that said, I have met many people who have experienced this sort of profound teamwork in sports or the performing arts or in business. Many say they have spent much of their life looking for that experience again. What they experienced was a learning organization. The team that became great didn't start off great. It learned how to produce extraordinary results. So I was like, well, I want that back. I want to do that again. I want to create that same kind of environment within the government. So I tried to steal as many ideas as I could from my Google experience, but adapt it to my new team. So one of the first things I did was I just started cranking out this prototype for this thing I called the Hub, which was sort of like, supposed to be like a documentation center and expose a graph of like who's working on what and where and with who else and that sort of thing. It was just kind of a mishmash, an amalgam of all these different systems that I had experienced with at Google. And eventually, also got hip to this thing called APIs. I don't know if you guys have heard of them. They're kind of a thing these days. But I was doing all this graph computation inside the hub, and I was like, well, why don't we make that a generic thing? So eventually we extracted an engine to expose that graph as interconnected API data, or JSON API data. And then we also kind of realized a lot of this, we shouldn't have to require people to go to a single place to update it. We've got GitHub repositories everywhere. What if we had a common metadata format where people could just say, this is the project, this is who works on it, and that's where we came up with the about.yaml schema. So, towards the end of my time at the government, I started working with people to streamline the pipeline from about.yaml to the team API to not just the hub, but other products as well. And I saw this as part of the foundation that I was trying to lay for grouplets within the government, particularly within my team. And I eventually organized 3. The first one was not testing. The first one was documentation. Because even though I had sort of come in with a reputation of, oh, Mike did this testing thing at Google, he's going to teach us all how to do testing, which scared me to death because I don't think people realize that I'm mostly a back-end guy. But I realized that if I was going to start trying to share what I knew about testing, I didn't want to have to repeat myself 50 times or 500 times. There needed to be a culture, a foundation of documentation and knowledge sharing. So I founded the documentation group, then I founded a testing group, and then I founded what we called the working group, which tried to help other working groups. So, and it worked, as you'll see, actually. Because in order to make it easier for these groups to kind of organize and do something productive, as well as share with their knowledge with the broader public, I started developing a little engine that I called Pages, which is basically a cheap knockoff of GitHub Pages that is on government infrastructure, because for reasons we could no longer officially publish canonical government content on github.io. So along with creating this knockoff that works just the same as GitHub Pages, you just push to another branch and your thing is published, I created this format called Guides, which has like these common style elements, the menu and things like that. Stole that from another existing document and said, hey, we should use this for all the things. And these sites, they're all using Jekyll. If you're not familiar with it, it's a Ruby tool for generating static websites. And they all are based on, all the content is in a GitHub repository. And these are 2 technologies that the team was already using extensively for several of its client projects. So I found a way to take tools and workflows that were already familiar to the team that I joined and then applied those to help solve the problem of knowledge sharing across the team. And the other nice feature, of course, because we were trying to promote open source, we did things in GitHub, and we were publishing this on a publicly accessible site, we actually started getting some comments and feedback from some people in the general public. If we wrote a blog post about the content guide, then these people who really cared about grammar would start sending pull requests for the content guide. Same thing for accessibility or even testing, things like that. One of the other, and I didn't put it in my slides, and I should point out, there's a guides template. So on top of using the familiar workflow and packaging all these common elements in a easily usable Ruby gem, I created this guides template, which was a guide to create a guide. So by creating this template where people could start working through it and then replacing the template content with their own thing, we ended up with a good many working groups and other teams generating guide content that was just published like that. By the way, if anybody, I think I'm doing pretty good on time, so if anybody has any comments or questions, if you feel inspired to raise your hand now, please do. Otherwise, there'll be plenty of time at the end. So there was another problem that came up. So my team used Slack heavily, like for practically everything. It's a highly distributed team, so all these important conversations happen in Slack all the time. The team was growing, new people are coming in. And so it became apparent that a lot of this repetitive questioning and knowledge sharing was happening in Slack. But nobody's going to show up 6 months after a question was answered and go all the way back through the chat history and filter through hundreds of channels to figure out, to find the information that's recorded there. So we started developing this thing we called the handbook. Like not so much a guide, but it's the same Jekyll pages-based kind of thing. But it was like more proactively curated to serve the needs of the entire team. And one of the traditions that the original handbook authors introduced was, hey, if you see somebody say something important in Slack just added this feature to put emoji reactions on messages. So put a little tree on it, and we'll come back later and we'll triage it and make sure that important knowledge gets captured in the handbook. But as you can imagine, that's a great first step, but then that kind of gets tedious after a while. So eventually, I got tricked into writing a bot to automate the process of when somebody does add an emoji reaction to something important, the bot will go file a GitHub issue for it. So this is the first test message that I used that actually worked. I put a little emoji tree on it, and the bot went and created this GitHub issue, which said, hey, somebody said something important at this channel at this time. Has a URL to this message. And then the bot comes back and says, hey, great, we filed an issue, check. And notifies me, that because I put it on there, that, hey, the whole thing worked. There's a new issue filed. And so this was just another way of trying to reduce the friction, because we also had a lot of non-technical people that would join the team, and they didn't really want to interact with GitHub that much. So this made it much easier for them to say, well, if I'm an HR person, or if I'm primarily a content person that doesn't do a whole lot of code or whatever, you can still participate in this process. You put a little button on it, and it does the GitHub filing for you. And then the handbook maintainers can go back and triage all these issues and make sure that they get poured into the handbook. Now, one thing that still hasn't happened yet that I really wish I could show it to you right now, but for some reason, they still haven't made it publicly available yet. It's still behind a auth firewall, so it's a really cool thing. I wish I could show it to you, but maybe one day. But it was a very, very, very well done product. Now, one of the other ideas I had as part of this experience is I wanted to recreate code labs or something resembling it. And these were the things that we did inside Google, little examples, typically on a wiki page that said, here's how you write a unit test for this, or here's how you write a program that uses Bigtable, all these kind of things. And so by the time I wrote this bot, I realized, hey, this is a real program, but it's not very big, but it does a lot of interesting stuff. It's well tested. So I created an example out of it. I created this tutorial, which I'm actually in town. A bunch of folks from the tutorial are actually here watching this. But the idea here was I thought it would be a good example to say, don't just come up with contrived things. Try to use some real code that you're developing on your products, make an example of some important principle, and then communicate that with a tutorial using the same guides format, but rather than just being a plain reference volume, it has that interactive component to it. And then, again, I was about to start trying to organize an EDU team within within this government team, but I didn't. I ran out of time. But the idea was, eventually the EDU team would hopefully become the custodians of tutorials, education, training materials, things like that. So kind of out of band with this whole guide and tutorial mission, like I said, we have a lot of GitHub repos. We want people to be able to, make contributions or maybe take the things that we write and use them for their own purposes. So we began to realize READMEs were actually a really important topic that we should spend some time encouraging good practices for. And so, one of the things that we realized is a lot of READMEs are just like, run these 50 shell commands, and then, everything will work, except, at command number 27, things go to hell, and you can't find your way back. So one of the core things here is sometimes straight up documentation is not the answer, because if you've got a bunch of commands, that's not a README, that's a script. You should write a script. You should do that heavy lifting for the consumer. And so if you're doing like a node project, NPM is a good choice, has the script capability. And then I got this idea, we call it a Go script. It has nothing to do with the Go programming language. There was an article written by a thought worker, or 2 articles a few years ago, that talked about, hey, don't just have a README with a pile of commands, write a script, and then in your README, you can make reference to higher level commands rather than do this, do this, do this. So primarily, we wanted people to get a quick idea of what does this package do? Why should you care? Straight up, what do you need to do to install the system? Do you need to run out and install another language runtime? What are the script commands in this repository that do all the configuration and things you need to do? And then if people actually want to contribute, make changes to the code base, what's the basics that they need to know? You don't have to have a full developer guide in a README. You can say, go read the developer guide and have that maintained somewhere else. So the idea of a README is people are kind of expecting that I can get kind of a quick high level of the most important things I need to know and then drill into what I care about. So using that bot as an example, this is the actual name of the bot. It's the name of a NPM package. But you can see, super high level, this is what it does and why you should care with a little screenshot. If you know how Slack works, it makes perfect sense. If you don't, go learn about Slack. In fact, I think I got a little Slack link in there. And then down here, you could see where we start going into the installation instructions, just a handful of high-level understandable things. And I actually had a relatively new content member of the team that joined the doc group. This became her personal mission, and she had taken the README that my first draft and turned it into something actually readable. So I was very happy with that development. And further down, it talks about if you're a developer, obviously you could see what if the bill is passing, what you need to install, that sort of thing. Now, one way I mentioned earlier about maybe one of your options is creating a catastrophe. You might not have to do that, but you can still find something to create a sense of urgency, whether it's a Fixit, as in the case of Google. But we realized that onboarding was becoming a big issue. It was a small but growing team, and people come in, they need information, they have all these questions. So we began to use that as a forcing function for a lot of the things that we wanted to do in terms of knowledge sharing. Because if it's easy for new people to find information about HR or travel or conferences, reimbursement, different offices, all that sort of thing, then it's going to be really easy for even people been there from the beginning to find that information and hopefully keep it up to date. They're a great test audience for things like READMEs and guides. People coming in fresh to a system that they've been assigned to work on. They'll have all sorts of useful suggestions for you. And then you could say, hey, you want to make a contribution already? Then send a pull request. So it's a really kind of great virtuous cycle that you can get into by taking onboarding as a serious process that helps everybody get acclimated and also incrementally improves our knowledge sharing. And build up a handbook. Like that's essentially another nice side effect is you don't have to have the perfect handbook from the beginning. You could just see what questions people have coming in and develop from there for the benefit of everybody. Now, I'm here leading a workshop, and it's the first time I've led this workshop. It's very ad hoc. I'm learning a lot of things, but the point is, you don't have to wait till you have a huge training budget or you have a lot of experts. It doesn't really take that much to start, creating a trend of workshops. You could just, find some common topic that people care about, piece of real code, grab some friends for lunch, I guess this lunch is different, but if you have lunch on other days, then maybe you can grab a few people and say, let's, learn something. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to finish Moby Dick in a week, right? Like you could just find a little piece and get in the habit, start a culture of informal, incremental learning. So kind of the upshot of all this, why I want to focus on documentation and training, is that you really don't have to be a mega company like Google with all the resources and all the experts and the people that can make everything perfect. You just have to have the right attitude, the willingness to want to share knowledge, maybe create that sense of urgency, whether it's onboarding or maybe you do have a crisis that's brewing. And be creative. Go into your bathrooms and start filling the walls with information that everybody should know. But yeah, it's a lot of hard work. Like I said, at Google it took 5 years. The government is just getting started. It's not over yet. But one thing's for sure is that as hard work as that can be, it's not nearly as hard of having to deal with people keep doing the wrong things over and over, asking the same questions, writing monolithic pieces of code that are impossible to test. And that is basically the whole of my presentation, and open to any questions or comments you may have. Any contestants? Yeah. Or maybe you should wait for the mic.
Thank you.
What were the different challenges you ran into when you were trying to get people to not unit test, but just write tests for like old legacy code that was in production that they might not be able to change versus new code?
So a lot of times, like just thinking about the mercenaries in particular, what we would do at the beginning of an engagement was watch the code review thread, so whatever people were changing. And if we saw them, for example, if there was like a new feature, like a new piece of behavior, and it was just like an if statement slapped into the middle of a 50-line function, we would kind of stop them and say, wait a second, if you wrote another function for this, look how you could test it, and give them like a little snippet of sample code. So we would kind of seize those little teachable moments. And so over time, as people kind of get in the habit, see how we think, what we're looking for by seizing on changes to their own code, then the ideal, it didn't always happen, right? Like there were good engagements, there were engagements we won't talk about. But for the ones that worked, people eventually, I think, just kind of started to see how we thought and started to look for the opportunities themselves. In terms of like because of course there weren't mercenaries on every project at Google, so we couldn't afford to do that all over the place. But when we did encounter, like with the mercenaries, if we did encounter like, oh, here's a problem we solved for this project, maybe other projects would have the same problem, we'd write a testing on the toilet episode, or a series of them, if you will, and kind of try to spread the knowledge out that way. But by and large, it really came down to not just seizing on those examples, publishing them where we could, but fixing the tools and incrementally just kind of having that conversation by driving testing on the toilet ideas, test certified, just kind of getting that, creating like a little background hum that people eventually started to comprehend. And then we hit a tipping point. Actually, I like to tell folks I think we hit the tipping point just before the financial crisis, because at that point we couldn't rely on having so many manual testers anymore. But fortunately, the automated testing discipline had started to take hold to the point where there wasn't like a quality crisis after that happened. Which I'm not saying we can all take, the testing grouplet can take credit for saving Google in 2008. I'm not saying that, but I am saying it was nice to see that there wasn't like just a massive slowdown in development when that occurred. I hope that sort of answered your question. Okay. Another one? All right, microphone. Oh, sorry. Hi.
Hi. So keeping docs in sync with processing code changes is something that I've had some difficulty with. Do you have any like good advice or insights on how to, as things that are being documented change, how to keep the docs in sync?
Yeah. There's a couple things float through my mind. The first thing is the best docs are the ones you don't have to write. So the extent to which you write scripts instead of just throwing commands in a text file, automate where you can, and get people to just follow good design principles, whether you're talking about low-level code design or architectural patterns. But you kind of tap into like that common awareness, the idioms of a language or an application domain. If once you get into that groove, there's many things that you don't have to document, for example. I mean, when I say pull request to you folks, I don't have to say, well, a pull request is, something where you have to go to this website called GitHub, and you have to use this tool called Git, which is a distributed, we have the language. So when I say we did something in Jekyll that was hosted on GitHub, I didn't have to go much deeper than that for you. But for those cases where you do need to actually update documentation, I would say for a general topic like testing, that's where the grouplets come in. That's where you've got like the crazy fanatical instigators. They're like, oh no, we have to tell everybody the right way or else things will go off a cliff. And some people are highly motivated to do that kind of work. Otherwise, if it's really something that, this sucks and we really should do something about it, whether it's a grouplet or a normal project team, just create stories for it. Put it in your backlog. Say, we're not just going to bury, maybe it's a lower priority item, and maybe you have like a little mini Fixit or a sprint where you say, well, this day we're going to burn through some doc items. But it comes back to the idea of, we have something that's going to start dragging on our productivity. Let's make a story to fix it. Did I answer it? Okay. Hi.
Hi. What about trying to teach developers what they needed to test rather than the all-encompassing idea of we've got to have 100% test coverage?
So here was the pitfall with test certified. We had a recommendation, that pyramid kind of visualized it roughly, is that most projects should shoot for a ratio of 70% coverage from small tests, 20% from medium, and 10% from large. And some people really latched onto those numbers as either absolute or, they're complete horseshit. How could you possibly recommend this? But in between the extremes, we actually had productive discussion taking place, where people would say, well, okay, I work on a core library. I don't really need a system test per se because I don't have a service that I'm launching. Something like the Google Web Server mainly is integrating features from other places. So they had some small tests, of course, but they actually had a lot of medium to large-ish tests because that's what their application called for. So the most important thing was to get people thinking and talking, to go from this place of, oh, I don't test because I don't have time, or, my code's too hard to test, to where we just wouldn't let up with the conversation through testing on the toilet and test certified. We wouldn't let up, and so people would have the opportunity to start convincing themselves to listen a little bit. And then maybe they would hear, oh, well, I have, Bigtable does this. I work on MapReduce, so I'm going to do something similar. And they kind of, rather than us having to tell everybody, thou shalt do testing of this in this way, it just became something that they naturally allowed to filter into their consciousness, and they convinced themselves of, oh, this is something we need to test. So the conversation now isn't generally, should this be tested? It's, how should we test this? So that was kind of the end state. Does that answer your question? Other folks, we have a free microphone. Or y'all are ready to go back for seconds?
I have one. So
Sure.
you mentioned that the death march that you'd been on, and
What
that other
was it?
folks hadn't been on that sort of thing before.
Mm-hmm.
Was that? Would you say that was the catalyst that pushed you into being pretty dogmatic about testing?
Well, in a way, I mean, it was. I hope to think I'm not that dogmatic, but it didn't directly push me. I kind of stumbled into testing after the Death March. So if I can try and paraphrase it quickly, I worked for Northrop Grumman, working on systems for the Coast Guard, and when I joined the team, the team had just received basically a tarball of code. We were in Newport News, Virginia. That's where I grew up. And the code came down from Reston or whatever, from the team that had been working on the contract. Team got the code. It wouldn't even compile. And when they finally did get it to compile and run, whenever it didn't crash, it would take minutes and minutes and minutes. It was rendering nautical charts, basically. We had this data called vector product format, that has all these nautical features in it. And so the product was rendering these charts at different, zoom levels, turning features on, turning features off, laying charts on top of one another. So that was the problem we were trying to solve. And so this code was a mess. When it worked, it took forever. It was horrible. So we had this assignment from the Coast Guard. They wanted to sell this product to the Navy, but the Navy required a certification. And it was called the Direct Read Certification. And we made the certification, but we almost didn't all make it out alive. There were painful meetings. There were literal tears. Not everybody was on their best behavior, including me. It was early in my career. I was a jerk. So somehow we got across that finish line. The Coast Guard's like, thank you, that's so great. Now, we don't care how long it takes, just make the damn thing faster. Right? So by that time, we had some experience with the system, and I had ideas around how we were parsing and serving up this data for rendering. And just by chance, so I had already started reading a bunch of books. It was C++ project, effective C++, exceptional C++, C++ programming language, C++ templates. I was consuming all this stuff. But I happened to pick up a copy of the C and C++ Users Journal where there was an article about C-unit or CPP unit. I thought, that's an interesting idea. Writing a program to test code, just test it. That's neat. I'm going to play with this. So as I started rewriting this data subsystem, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to start with this little piece of the spec, and oh, that's cool. Look, I can see the data. I don't have to fire up a whole system. It's just a little program telling me that. And so I started, getting hooked super early on that. So within the space of, I think maybe 3 months it was, I had rebuilt this system. And one of the core nautical chart, actually it was the Hampton Roads nautical chart, because that's where we were from. This chart that normally took, 90 seconds to render, and it had big holes in it, and sometimes it crashed. I got it down, the first pass, I got it down to 12 seconds with almost everything rendering correctly. And then within another couple months, I got it down to under 5 seconds with pretty much everything rendering correctly. So yeah, at that point, the Coast Guard folks thought I walked on water. They didn't know why. I'm like, it's just stupid unit testing, right? So that was my experience. There was a death march, and I stumbled into unit testing. But that was the thing that gave me the religion by the time I got to Google, where it's like, oh my God, we got to fix this.
All right, I think we're about out of time. Thanks, Mike.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.